I was seated 2 chairs from the end of the conference table, back straight, hands folded on top of a thin folder with my notes clipped inside. The air conditioning pushed a steady chill across my knuckles. Across from me, the wall screen glowed with a slide deck I recognized down to the kerning. Calder's voice carried the room like it belonged to him. "So, before we waste anyone's time," he said, smiling toward the head of the table, "let's be clear about authorship. This initiative is mine. The framework is mine. The strategy is mine." A few people laughed politely, not because it was funny, because that's what rooms like this do when the person with the title performs. I let my eyes settle on the glass water carafe at the center of the table. It was sweating slightly, a thin ring forming underneath. A small, neutral thing. Something steady to look at while someone tried to move the ground under your feet. Calder tapped the presentation remote against his palm. Click. A new slide appeared, my market segmentation, reorganized but unmistakable. On the far side of the room sat 2 board members, a counsel from outside the company, and our CFO with her laptop open and angled slightly away from the table like a shield. There were also 3 senior managers and 1 invited guest, an investor's representative, who'd been introduced at the start with a careful, respectful tone. Status always announces itself quietly. Calder turned toward the screen and spoke as if he were explaining something he'd invented in the shower. "The problem in our space," he said, "is that everyone's building tools for themselves. Nobody's building tools for the people who actually keep operations moving." He paused, waiting for nods. He got them. He loved that part. Then he looked down the table and found me, like a man locating a minor detail in a contract. "And this is why," he continued, still smiling, "we can't afford amateur thinking on my team." The word landed and the room shifted. I didn't move. I didn't blink faster. I let the moment settle. Silence has weight when you let it. Calder took a step closer to the table, close enough that his shadow touched the edge of my folder. "I'm going to say this once," he said, voice bright with performance. "You're not presenting today. You're not speaking to the board. You're not answering questions." He glanced at the investor's representative, as if checking whether the humiliation was landing with the right audience. "In fact," he added, "starting now, you won't be attached to this project at all." The CFO's typing stopped. I watched her fingers hover above the keys, then rest, as if she'd decided any sound might make things worse. Calder continued, comfortable in the quiet he'd created. "I know you've been eager," he said, "but eagerness isn't competence. And I'm not going to risk a flagship initiative because someone confused note-taking with leadership." My folder sat under my hands, plain and closed. A small rectangle of paper and clips. It would have been easy, almost reflexive, to open it to slide out the annotated timeline, the research summaries, the drafts with version history. But that would have been an argument, and arguments are gifts. They give people like Calder something to climb onto, so I did nothing. Calder's smile sharpened. "Look at me," he said, like he was coaching a child. I raised my eyes to his briefly, not defiant, not pleading, just present. He held the gaze for half a second, then turned away, satisfied by his own courage. "To be clear," he said to the room, "she's been assisting with admin support, scheduling notes, that sort of thing. Useful but not strategic." A board member, a woman in a tailored jacket, hair pinned back, tilted her head as if she'd heard something slightly off-key. She didn't speak. She simply watched. Calder mistook the silence for agreement. "Now," he said, "I'll take questions at the end. Let's keep it tight." Click. Another slide. My pricing model simplified. He walked through it quickly, too quickly. His voice rose and dipped in rehearsed confidence, but he missed the small seams where the logic needed support. That would become important later. For now, it was just noted. The investor's representative leaned forward and asked, "What's your customer acquisition cost assumption based on?" Calder didn't hesitate. He loved questions. Questions were his stage. "We've validated it with internal analysis," he said. "We're conservative." The counsel from outside the company glanced toward me, just a flick, almost unintentional, then returned to her legal pad. Her pen paused, then continued. A tiny decision made quietly. Calder kept going. 10 minutes in, he made a joke about overly emotional project contributors. He looked at me when he said it, like a man pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurt. Somebody chuckled. Not much. Enough. I focused on the edge of the conference table. The veneer had a faint scratch near my right thumb, a mark that had probably been there for years. I traced it once with the pad of my thumb and stopped. It reminded me that this room had seen other meetings, other performances, other collapses. Nothing in here was permanent except the paperwork. Calder reached the end of his deck and set the remote down like a gavel. So, he said, that's the vision, that's the plan, that's the leadership. He let the words hang, then added, softer, as if offering mercy. And if anyone's concerned about the support staff, don't be. We've already adjusted the org chart accordingly. Support staff? He didn't even look at me when he said that part. He looked at the board like I was already removed. Fairness doesn't require volume. The board chair cleared his throat. All right, before we move to questions, Calder, I want to confirm the team structure you're proposing. Calder's smile returned, relaxed. Of course. The board chair glanced at the CFO, then at counsel, then finally down the table toward me. The room went very quiet, not awkward quiet, intentional quiet. The kind of quiet people use when they're deciding what they're willing to witness. I kept my hands folded on the folder. I didn't reach for anything. I didn't offer an explanation. I simply sat there, still enough to let everyone feel exactly what Calder had just done. And I waited. My name is Alina Morales. I was 36 at the time, a senior product strategist by function if not by title, living in San Mateo and commuting south 4 days a week, because I preferred to keep my life slightly separate from my work. I paid my rent on time. I had no debt beyond a modest mortgage. I kept my calendar clean and my records cleaner. I'd joined Calder's company 3 years earlier, during its first real growth phase, when the headcount was small enough that responsibility moved faster than titles. I was brought in to stabilize operations and help translate early concepts into something investors could recognize. That was the agreement. It was stated plainly, in writing, during my second interview. I did exactly that. I built frameworks that other people could talk about. I created models that survived scrutiny. I documented everything because scale requires memory, and memory requires discipline. None of this was heroic. It was work that needed doing, and I was capable of doing it well. The imbalance didn't begin that morning in the boardroom. It had existed quietly, reinforced through repetition. Calder spoke. I prepared. Calder presented. I revised. Calder received credit. I received more responsibility. That pattern held because it was useful to him, and because the company needed continuity more than it needed theater. I absorbed pressure that wasn't mine. I stayed late when timelines slipped. I handled external partners when promises were made prematurely. When early pilots failed, I rewrote the assumptions and adjusted the models without commentary. I didn't correct Calder publicly when he misspoke, because the cost of that correction would have been higher than the mistake itself. That restraint was not accidental. There were 2 sacrifices that mattered. First, I delayed my own advancement by refusing to make noise. Second, I took accountability for outcomes that were structurally outside my authority. Both decisions were made consciously, and both were recorded, sometimes formally, sometimes not. What Calder violated in that room wasn't personal loyalty. It was professional fairness. There was an implicit agreement that contribution and credit would remain aligned enough for the work to continue. He broke that alignment publicly, with witnesses, and assumed the imbalance would hold because it always had. People like him mistake silence for softness. They also mistake patience for permission. When he removed me from the project in front of the board, he wasn't asserting dominance. He was formalizing a separation that already existed beneath the surface. He simply chose to announce it before he understood the structure he was standing inside. The room felt different after that meeting. Not hostile, not sympathetic, just recalibrated. Order matters. And when it's disrupted, systems respond, eventually. Calder's behavior in that meeting wasn't an escalation. It was a continuation. From my first quarter at the company, authorship moved in one direction. I drafted. He refined the language. The idea became his. At first, the shifts were subtle, phrasing adjusted here, a slide reordered there. Nothing that justified a correction, especially not in rooms where momentum mattered more than precision. By month 6, the pattern had stabilized. I would circulate a memo outlining a problem and 3 possible approaches. Calder would respond with a single-line edit, then reference his thinking in the next leadership sync. I would update the documentation to reflect the decision and move on. The work advanced. That was the priority. There were moments where the imbalance was visible to others. Once, during a quarterly review, a senior manager asked a technical question Calder couldn't answer. He glanced toward me without turning his head. I answered neutrally, and he nodded as if I'd confirmed his intuition. No one challenged it. The meeting continued. I tracked these moments the way I tracked everything else, quietly, consistently. Emails were archived, version histories preserved, meeting notes time-stamped, not for leverage, for continuity. If something broke later, I needed to know where the fault lines actually were. Calder's confidence grew in proportion to his insulation. He stopped reviewing details. He stopped asking questions. He began announcing conclusions without support. When those conclusions created downstream problems, I absorbed the correction work without comment. That was the second pattern: displacement. When a partner complained about scope creep, I was copied. When timelines slipped because commitments had been made prematurely, I recalibrated the plan. When an internal team flagged risk, I rewrote the assumptions and presented them as operational updates, not reversals. Calder stayed above the noise. I stayed in it. I was aware of the cost. I accepted it because the alternative, public friction, would have destabilized the company at a fragile stage. That calculation was rational at the time. There was one moment, 18 months in, when a junior analyst asked me why I didn't push back more. We were standing near the printer, waiting for a document to finish spooling. I told her, because timing matters. That was the closest I came to explaining myself. Calder began referring to me as support in broader forums around the same time. Not directly, casually, as if the label had always been there. I corrected it once privately. He laughed and said titles were fluid. They are. Ownership is not. By the time the project that would become the flagship initiative was greenlit, the structure was already set. I was embedded deeply enough that removing me would cause disruption. Calder assumed that leverage protected him. He didn't account for documentation, or memory, or the fact that systems don't respond to confidence, they respond to records. Silence can look like compliance. Sometimes it's just preparation. By the time the flagship initiative was approved internally, most of the work had already been done. Not the visible work, the slides, the talking points, but the structural work that determines whether an idea survives contact with reality. I handled the procedural spine. That meant documenting the development timeline in 6-week blocks. It meant logging decision rationales, not just outcomes. It meant attaching assumptions to names and dates so that, if questioned later, they could be traced without interpretation. Every file had version history enabled. Every external communication was summarized internally. Every meeting note included attendance and action items. This wasn't paranoia. It was standard practice at scale. Calder didn't interfere with it because he didn't see it. Process, to him, was background noise. There were delays, always are. Legal needed clarification on data usage. Finance requested a revised forecast after an upstream cost changed. One potential partner backed out during diligence, citing risk tolerance. Each pause required adjustments, sign-offs, and follow-up meetings. I attended all of them. Calder attended the ones with cameras. During one review, counsel asked for confirmation on intellectual ownership boundaries. The question was narrow and procedural. I answered it and forwarded the relevant documentation afterward, as requested. No one reacted. The meeting moved on. That moment mattered, though. It established continuity. As the initiative progressed, additional layers were added: compliance review, investor disclosures, internal audit checks. Each layer created friction. Each friction point produced more documentation. I made sure it was stored, indexed, and accessible. Calder never asked to see any of it. He assumed that because he spoke last, he decided last. That's a common misunderstanding. In reality, decisions are often made earlier, by quieter mechanisms, and simply acknowledged later by louder ones. There was a point, midway through the second quarter, when I was asked, formally, to step in as interim point of contact during Calder's absence. He was traveling. The request came from operations and was CC'd to legal and finance. I accepted, fulfilled the role, and handed it back without commentary when he returned. Nothing about that exchange was emotional. It was administrative. It created a paper trail. I didn't escalate issues unless escalation was required. I didn't volunteer opinions unless asked. I maintained consistency, because consistency builds trust, and trust determines who gets listened to when pressure arrives. Calder mistook that consistency for invisibility. By the time the org chart was adjusted, as he'd put it in the boardroom, the system already recognized where responsibility actually lived. Titles lag reality. Records don't. Preparation isn't dramatic, it's cumulative. And once it's complete, it doesn't need defending. The mechanism that mattered was never emotional, and it was never personal. It existed long before Calder decided to perform dominance in public. 18 months earlier, when the initiative was still theoretical, legal had raised a routine concern. The company was moving quickly, pulling in outside consultants, testing pilots with external data, and circulating early concepts to potential partners. Council recommended a protective structure around intellectual development, nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. The solution was practical. A subsidiary entity was formed to house exploratory work until commercialization. Ownership was conditional, tied to contribution thresholds and continuity requirements. The purpose was risk containment. If the idea failed, exposure would be limited. If it succeeded, ownership would formalize cleanly. I was assigned operational oversight of that structure because I was already managing the documentation flow. It made sense. Someone had to track compliance, maintain records, and coordinate filings. Calder approved it with a glance and a signature. He trusted momentum more than detail. My role was defined narrowly. I wasn't an owner. I wasn't a beneficiary. I was a steward, responsible for ensuring that conditions were met and recorded accurately. If they weren't, the structure defaulted to protection mode until discrepancies were resolved. That clause wasn't punitive. It was preventative. Over time, as development accelerated, contributions became asymmetrical. Strategic direction came from Calder's office. Execution, refinement, and validation came from mine. That split wasn't hidden. It was documented. Deliverables were logged. Dependencies were mapped. Attribution existed whether anyone read it or not. When Calder publicly removed me from the project, he triggered a condition he didn't realize existed. Continuity mattered. Oversight mattered. Removal without formal transition created a gap. Gaps in regulated structures don't resolve themselves. I didn't activate anything. I didn't file a complaint or issue a demand. I simply acknowledged the change as stated and updated the records accordingly. The system responded the way it was designed to respond, by pausing advancement until compliance was restored. There was no appeal built into that stage. Only process. Leverage doesn't need force when it's embedded correctly. It just needs time. The follow-up session was scheduled 10 days later, not urgently, not defensively. It appeared on calendars as a clarification review, requested jointly by legal and finance. Calder forwarded the invite with a single line, routine cleanup. I arrived early and took a seat along the side of the room, not at the table. Same building, different floor. This room had no screen wall, just a long table, a speakerphone in the center, and a stack of printed packets placed neatly at each chair. I didn't touch the packet in front of me. The board chair arrived first, then the CFO, then outside counsel. 2 additional legal representatives joined via video. Calder came in last, phone still in hand, smiling like a man walking into confirmation. He stopped when he saw me, not fully, just enough to register surprise. "I thought she was no longer involved," he said lightly, glancing around the room. No one answered him. Silence isn't always confrontation. Sometimes it's alignment. The board chair gestured for everyone to sit. Calder did, still relaxed, crossing one ankle over his knee. Council began. This meeting is to formally confirm project continuity and ownership status following recent structural changes, she said. Calm, procedural. We'll be referencing documentation already circulated. She opened her packet. The sound of paper was loud in the quiet room. Calder leaned back. Happy to clarify, he said. I've already explained the org adjustments. Council nodded. This isn't about org charts. That was the first crack. She turned a page. As part of the initiative's early risk mitigation, a subsidiary structure was established. Ownership progression was conditional upon uninterrupted stewardship and verified contribution continuity. Calder's smile thinned. Yes, standard. Yes, Council agreed. And stewardship responsibility was assigned to Alina Morales. She said my name cleanly. No emphasis. Calder looked at me then, really looked. His expression didn't change much, but something behind it recalculated. That was administrative, he said. Oversight. The CFO spoke next, eyes on her laptop. Oversight that included compliance certification, which is required for progression. Calder laughed once, too fast. We're not suggesting progress stalled because of a staffing decision. The CFO didn't look up. We're confirming that progress did stall. Silence returned, thicker this time. Council slid a document forward, aligning it with the edge of the table. On the date Alina was formally removed from the project, continuity was broken without transition. Per Clause 4.2, advancement paused automatically. Calder leaned forward. That's absurd. I'm the one driving this. Council didn't react. Drive and documentation are not interchangeable. He opened his packet for the first time, flipping pages quickly. Too quickly. His knee bounced once under the table, then stopped when he noticed it. So what are you saying? He asked. That we redo paperwork? No, Council said. That ownership did not vest. The room went very still. Calder's voice sharpened. That's not possible. We've been presenting this as core company IP. And that representation, the CFO said evenly, is now under review. Calder looked around the room, searching for support. He found none. The board chair's hands were folded. The legal team on video waited, unmoving. He turned back to me. You didn't say anything. I met his gaze for a moment. Then I looked back at Council. Silence is sometimes the correct response. Council continued. This isn't punitive, it's procedural. The structure did exactly what it was designed to do, pause when conditions weren't met. Calder's composure fractured, not loudly, subtly. His voice rose half a register. This is ridiculous, he said. She was support staff. This is a technicality. The board chair finally spoke. Calder, enough. That stopped him. The issue, the chair continued, is that you made a unilateral decision without understanding the framework in place. That framework predates this conflict. Calder's jaw tightened. So what happens now? Council answered. Now the initiative remains unvested. Use is restricted. External representations must be corrected, and any attempt to proceed requires formal remediation. And her? He asked, jerking his chin toward me. Council followed his gesture. Alina remains the recorded steward until a compliant transition occurs. Calder stared at the table, then at his packet, then back up, eyes bright with something close to panic. This can't be right, he said. Fix it. No one moved. I spoke then, just once. I'm comfortable deferring to Council, I said. My voice was level. They're explaining it accurately. That was all. Calder pushed his chair back slightly. You planned this. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Council closed her folder. We'll circulate next steps in writing. The meeting ended without ceremony. Chairs shifted. Screens went dark. Calder remained seated for a moment, staring at the packet like it might rearrange itself. Systems don't respond to outrage. They respond to record. I wasn't present for what followed. That mattered. 3 weeks after the review, Finance issued a corrected disclosure to the board and external partners. It was brief, precise. It stated that the initiative's ownership status was under review and that any forward-facing representations were paused pending remediation. No names were mentioned. By the end of the quarter, the pause had done its work. Without the ability to position the initiative as proprietary, Calder's projections lost their leverage. Investor calls shortened. One prospective partner withdrew quietly, citing uncertainty. Another asked for revised terms that shifted risk back onto the company. Those conversations happened without me. Legal challenges came next. Not dramatic ones, formal inquiries, requests for clarification, attempts to reinterpret language that had already been read aloud. Each was answered in writing. Each response cited the same clauses. Each attempt failed at the same point. The system held. By mid-year, internal adjustments followed. Headcount froze. A planned expansion was deferred. Calder stopped traveling. His name appeared less frequently in company updates, replaced by neutral phrasing, leadership, the executive team, the organization. I learned about these changes indirectly. A forwarded memo, a third-party notice, a brief mention in a quarterly summary, no commentary attached. Toward the end of the year, a professional bulletin circulated in our industry, one of those quiet notices that announce changes without explanation. Calder's role had been redefined, not removed, reduced. The language was careful, so was the timing. There were no apologies, no admissions, none were required. What collapsed wasn't his career, it was his insulation. Access narrowed, influence diluted. Rooms that once opened easily began to require justification. That kind of contraction doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. I remained absent throughout. That, too, was deliberate. Consequences don't need witnesses to be real. They just need structure. By the time the initiative was formally reassigned and stabilized under new stewardship, Calder's name no longer appeared on it at all. The work continued. Quietly, correctly, fairness doesn't rush. It arrives when the record catches up. A year passed before the matter fully settled. The initiative was integrated under a different division, with revised leadership and clearer boundaries. It stopped being talked about as a breakthrough and started being treated like what it was, work. That was the point. When systems function properly, spectacle fades. I didn't return to the company. There was no exit scene, no closing conversation worth recounting. My transition was handled through counsel and human resources, in writing, over a series of clean steps. Final compensation was paid on schedule. References were neutral and accurate. That was sufficient. What remained with me was not satisfaction. It was clarity. Authority, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself in rooms or demand acknowledgement. It exists in structure, in continuity, in the quiet confidence that records will speak when voices fail. Calder confused attention for control. The system corrected that misunderstanding without urgency or cruelty. I took time afterward, not to recover but to recalibrate. I consulted selectively. I chose work where alignment was explicit and documentation was respected. When I committed, it was with terms that didn't require translation. Justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like balance restored and distance maintained. I still keep my records the same way. Dates, versions, decisions attached to names. Not because I expect conflict, but because order deserves reinforcement. The situation ended. It stayed ended, and I moved forward without needing to look back.